Alright, this lecture is about the former prophets, so this would be Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings. In the Hebrew Bible, Ruth is not placed between Judges and Samuel, so we'll deal with that book in the writing section in 2 weeks. I know the Pentateuch lecture was pretty long in the tooth, as they say, so let me just sort of summarize where we are here. The Pentateuch is about God redeeming the world through Israel, and we saw the four points that continue to run through the Pentateuch, and in those two trajectories: God's salvation through the line of Abraham, but also humanity's inability to obey. And so in the Pentateuch, what we see is God beginning promising to restore what was lost in Adam through the Abrahamic covenant. What was lost was land, obedience, rule, the task of cultivating and keeping and ultimately dwelling with God as his image bearers. And so the Abrahamic covenant is attempting to restore all of that, promising to restore all of that. Salvation isn't just about our individual souls, it's holistic, it's robust. It includes not just our soul's reunification with fellowship with the Godhead, but also a restoration of creation that was cursed, a restoration of our task, and a restoration of us dwelling in the land with the Lord. And so in the Pentateuch, what we see is this search for the seed, following Abraham's line, the big picture of salvation with the Exodus, and then Israel's continued failure to obey, coupled with God's continued mercy towards them in giving them law and in promising a Redeemer. Now, of course, he's been promising a Redeemer since Genesis 3:15, but that picture sort of fleshes out. The Redeemer will be a prophet like Moses. The Redeemer will lead them into the land. The Redeemer, as was promised Adam, will crush Satan's head. The Redeemer will be a king from Abraham's line. So that's what we're looking for in the former prophets. We end with this promise of an expectation that a prophet like Moses is yet to come, because Deuteronomy 34 says all the prophets since Moses, there's never been one greater than Moses. And now, we'll get to that later on when we get to latter prophets, because the implication there is not just that Joshua wasn't greater than Moses, but that none of the prophets in the entire history of Israel were greater than Moses. In any case, in the former prophets, this redemption through Israel, God's promise of redemption through Israel continues, particularly in their conquest of the land. And so God promises Israel that they're going to go into the land, they're going to dwell with God there, and they are going to have a king over them. They're going to be led by a prophet greater than Moses. God is going to give them rest from their enemies, etc. All of this is conditional, of course, on them obeying the law. And the story of the former prophets is the same story as we saw with Israel in the Pentateuch, namely that God calls them to holiness, calls them to be a royal priesthood, a holy nation, and they fail. They fail miserably. And so we sort of reach Israel's zenith with King David and then King Solomon, his son. And after that, everything continues to decline because Israel is captured in sin. This is no less true of David or Solomon than it is of anybody else in Israel. So because our lecture on the Pentateuch went so long, what I want to do here is just give you sort of a brief overview of the story of the former prophets. And I'm going to trust that the reading from House and from Dempster and also just in the Bible are going to give you the details you need, not only to connect the dots like I'm trying to do here, but to understand the dots. So this lecture, as with all of our lectures really on the biblical materials, is intended to be an overview, and in the actual reading is where hopefully the details will come together and be explained more. So we'll start with Joshua. Joshua is mentioned a variety of times in the Pentateuch, not just in the book of Joshua. He is key in the victory over the Amalekites. He's with Moses on at Mount Sinai when Moses receives the law. He's at the tent when Moses meets God, and he's sent out to spy Canaan, and he is the only faithful one other than Caleb to go and spy. So Joshua is presented as this faithful figure throughout the Pentateuch, and then he succeeds Moses. Sorry about this again. One of these days I'm going to get this right. The Deuteronomistic history is the term that some scholars use to refer to Joshua through Kings, although when the term arose, it actually included Deuteronomy itself because they believed it was a separate document. But we're not dealing with that here. I don't think that. I think the Pentateuch is Mosaic, and these books are authored by others. So the reason, though, that Deuteronomistic is still an accurate title is because the books of Joshua through Kings follow Deuteronomy in terms of blessings and curses. So what happens to Israel is directly related to Deuteronomy, particularly to how it lays out blessings and curses. And it covers the period from the entrance into the land under Joshua through the Davidic kingdom and then into the exile at the end of Kings. And as I've mentioned, the common threads, those two trajectories that I keep mentioning, Israel can't obey. They fail over and over and over again. Humanity cannot obey. Israel cannot obey. But at the same time, there's this salvific trajectory of waiting for a prophet like Moses, and then at the end of Deuteronomy, we add to that the layer of waiting for the son of David. And so really, what's happening in the Old Testament is this building of covenantal expectations. Because humanity continues to sin, because God's chosen people continues to sin, God continues to promise a Redeemer. And he makes these promises in covenants. He covenants with Adam to send the seed of Eve. He covenants with Noah not to destroy the earth so that the Redeemer can come. He covenants with Abraham, most importantly, to send a seed from his line that will restore what Adam lost. And we really could call the Adamic and the Abrahamic and then the Davidic sort of this, and then finally the New Covenant, we could call those four sort of the main covenantal thread. The Noahic covenant is subservient to these other covenants because it's basically a promise that God isn't going to destroy everything before he enacts salvation. The Mosaic covenant, as we've discussed already, is temporal. It's not universal. It's not eternal. It's also subservient to the Abrahamic covenant. It's preserving Israel until the Messiah comes. And so really what we have is God in these covenants, and particularly in the thread that runs from the Adamic to the Abrahamic to the Davidic to the New Covenant, we have this sort of flowering of expectations. With Adam, we start with just, the seed of woman is going to come and crush Satan's head. With Abraham, that's expanded to, not expanded, but it's understood to be, there's more details to be understood, I'll say it that way. We understand more details about who the Redeemer is, namely it's from Adam's line. And we understand more about what the Redeemer is going to do, namely he's going to restore what Adam lost. With Moses, the part of that covenant that does, because it's subservient to the Abrahamic covenant and temporal doesn't mean it's not connected to it. and it is. It's temporal. It's not the eternal Abrahamic covenant that God gives to Abraham, but it is connected to the Abrahamic covenant. It's serving the Abrahamic covenant. And in that particular covenant, the main sort of expansion or increased understanding of who the Messiah is, who the Redeemer is that he's a prophet like Moses. So we've got seed of Eve, son of Abraham, prophet like Moses, and then when we get towards the middle of the former prophets, we'll see that the next expectation that's increased in our understanding of what we're expecting is that it's going to be a king who is the son of David. And then when we get into the writings, we'll see that we're expecting the wise man, the man who has wisdom. And so, basically we're expecting a seed of Eve who's a son of Abraham, who is the king, son of David, the prophet like Moses, and the priest, the wise man, who obeys and is holy like the Lord, and who helps us to approach the Lord. Prophet, priest, king, son of Abraham, seed of Eve. These are all the expectations that we're expecting from the Old Testament. Then, of course, the New Covenant, which is, again, not a different covenant from the Abrahamic one, but an expansion of our understanding of it. The New Covenant promises that he's going to be the one who gives us the Spirit. He's the Spirit sender. And so all of these expectations are sort of building. We go from the seed expectation, which is that a seed of woman will come and crush Satan's head, and that seed flowers out into these other expectations that help us to understand who the seed is. They're not disconnected. They're not promises that supersede one another, but the Adamic covenant, the promise of the seed, flowers out, and we see that in expecting the seed, we are expecting a son of Abraham. In expecting the seed, we are expecting a prophet like Moses. In expecting the seed, we're expecting a son of David. In expecting the seed, we're expecting a wise and holy man who is a priest for us. In expecting the seed, we expect someone who is sending the Spirit to help us obey. So these are all the expectations that are sort of flowering out through the different covenants that God gives to different people in the Old Testament. And this, we get really the major one, for at least for Israelite expectations in the first century, in the Deuteronomistic history, because it's there that we get the Davidic covenant. That becomes sort of the main summary of all of the expectations of Israel. It's we're waiting for a son of David. And so in Joshua, the first thing that happens is, in this Deuteronomistic history, is Joshua, who's presented as a new Moses in Joshua 1. There's all these parallels between Joshua and Moses. Joshua goes into the land, and Israel conquers it. And then they divide and begin to settle. And on the one hand, the writer of the book of Joshua gives the impression that this is sort of a fulfillment of all the promises of Israel. There's language of resting from their enemies. There's language of being fruitful and multiplying. There's language of Joshua being the new Moses, the new prophet like Moses. So all of these expectations are sort of coming to a head with Joshua. There's also, so again, that trajectory is there, redemption. But the other one's there too, because Israel continues to fail. And we see this in Joshua even. We see this at Ai, when Achan hides some of the loot that he's not supposed to have, and Israel loses at Ai as a result. And we see it at the end of the book too. That's not the only place we see it in there conquering the land, but we see it at the end of the book too, because we see at the end of the book, Joshua says, "Choose this day whom you'll serve. As for me and my house, we will serve the Lord." And that's, on everybody's front door here in America, but it's a Christian. But the thing that nobody really notices is that in Joshua 24, Joshua says, "Choose this day whom you'll serve." And the Israelites respond and say, "Hey, we're going to serve Yahweh." And he says, "No, you're not." Nobody ever noticed. Nobody ever talks about this. He says, "No, you're not. You're going to go serve idols." you're not going to obey. And again, we see that other trajectory. Joshua knows what's going on. Joshua was there during the 40 years that Israel wandered. Joshua was there when Achan failed Israel at Ai. Joshua has been there. Joshua was there when Moses struck the rock and disobeyed. Joshua was there when they worshipped the golden calf. Joshua has seen this narrative history that we've talked about, and the Israelites say, we're going to serve Yahweh. Joshua says, no, you're not. And that's exactly what we see in Judges here in just a second. So in Joshua, what we see is transitioning power from Moses to Joshua. This continues to shape our expectations of what the Redeemer is going to look like. And in Joshua, we see that it's this prophet like Moses. Of course, Joshua 5 gives us a good indication that Joshua isn't the Redeemer, because Joshua has to bow down to the commander of the army of the Lord. He bows down and worships. He takes off his sandals, much like Moses took off his sandals in front of the burning bush, which gives us an indication that this commander is God. It is Yahweh. And so Joshua isn't it, but nevertheless, he's a picture of what we're looking for. Another theme is the conquest and division of Canaan. Again, an expectation of the Israelites in the Old Testament is rest from their enemies, and that fuels into it. And then God's faithfulness to his promises. God is faithful to Israel even though they continue to fail, and we're going to see that again in Judges. So in Judges, we start immediately after Joshua's death, and it ends prior to Samuel's birth. And so these are before David, so after Moses and before David, those are the two main leaders of Israel. And this is the period of time between their leadership. And basically what happens is what we've seen over and over again. I mean, we're going to continue to say this for the next however long it takes to finish this lecture, that this cycle of Israel is they sin, God punishes them, judges them. In Judges, it's through oppression, other nations coming in and oppressing them. Israel repents, and Yahweh delivers them. I mean, this particular way of saying it is pretty unique to Judges, but that's the cycle of Israel. The cycle of Israel is God delivers Israel, then they regress into sin, then there's some judgment that's meted out upon them, and they turn and repent, and and Yahweh delivers them again. And this is what happens in Judges. Here's a list. I'm not going to ask you to memorize that. Othniel, the first one, is sort of an exemplary judge. All the rest of them are hit and miss, pretty much. So you see, I mean, this is the major problem here. This is the start of it all, is that Moses tells them, go in and utterly destroy the nations that are there. Joshua tells them the same thing. And they don't. They like at Ai with Achan. Achan keeps loot that he was not supposed to, that he was supposed to destroy. Israel was not supposed to be tied off in any way to the nations that they were conquering because they would fall into idolatry. And in Judges 1 through 2:5, Israel fails to obey this. They failed to obey it in Joshua. They failed to obey it in Judges. And what happens because of that is they continue to disobey the covenant, namely through idolatry. They worship the other gods of the Canaanites, and God judges them through the oppression of other peoples. And finally, at the end of the book, Israelite society just collapses. And so this refrain that you see throughout the book of Judges, the people did what was right in their own eyes. That's what's going on. The other refrain, that there was no king in Israel, it's related to a lack of leadership as the problem. A lack of a prophet like Moses, and a lack, as we'll see later on, of a son of David. Here are some of the sins that we see over and over again in Judges. This point here, if we had more time, I'd go into it, but the point of this sentence is, don't preach moralistic sermons from Judges. The point of the book of Judges is not look to this person as your example. The point of Judges is that even the best among the Israelites are failures and we need a redeemer. That's the point of Judges. So the fundamental problem, as we see over and over, as you've heard me say over and over at this point, is that Israel cannot obey. They can't do it. And this usually, we see this in Judges and elsewhere in the Old Testament in two ways. First of all, idolatry, and then the result of idolatry, the second way we see it, is through intermarriage and or sexual immorality with pagan foreigners. And that's a cycle that just perpetuates itself. Because as you commit idolatry, you come to be in close relationship with those who are idolaters. And as you do that, you marry them and then create a culture of idolatry. So it's a perpetual problem. And this just doesn't ever stop. Israel can't obey. And so here's an outline for you. This goes through the cycle of Judges. I'm not going to ask you to memorize that or reproduce it. You do need to know sort of the basic outline. So there's evil that's done. Their sin prompts the anger of God, which leads him to bring oppression to the peoples. Then the people cry out. Then the Lord delivers them. And then there's a period of rest, usually 40 years. 40 is an important number. So let's pause here for just a second, and then we'll hit Samuel and Kings and be done. Think with me for a moment about how the fact that Israel cannot obey plays into our understanding of what the good news of Jesus Christ is. Think about that for just a minute. All right, well, let's continue with 1st and 2nd Samuel. Again, these are... I know the Pentateuch lecturer doesn't indicate this, but I'm going to try to keep these Bible lectures brief so that they will give you the overview and not just rehashing the details that you're going to find in House and Dempster. Okay, so please, please, please read the books. There are details on your quizzes that are in the books, in the reading, in the Bible. Please be familiar with the details and not just these lectures that, even though they may seem long, are actually pretty brief compared to the content we have to cover. So, basically, 1 Samuel is dealing with 3 leaders of Israel. First there is Samuel, then Saul, then David. Samuel is the last of the judges. Saul has a lot of characteristics of the judges, but Samuel is the last official judge since Saul is actually a king. And so Samuel is raised up by God during oppression by the Philistines to deliver them. But Israel continues to beg for a king. And so Samuel, as the prophet and judge that he is called on by God to anoint one, but the king that Samuel anoints is a king that the people have asked for, not that he gives them. In other words, he gives them what they want, not what they need. And Saul is a disaster. He makes tons of mistakes. David is anointed in his place, but Saul doesn't like that, so he persecutes David throughout the rest of the book of 1st and 2nd Samuel, actually. Through 2nd Samuel 5 or so. David is still dealing with issues of Saul or his house. Saul dies at the end of 1 Samuel, but his predecessor or his successors persecute David for a bit. So, really, most of the book of 1 Samuel is this conflict between Saul and David. Saul, the king that the fallen people choose for themselves. David, the king that God has for them. It's a pretty important contrast. Saul, like I said, is a disaster. There are 3 decisions that he makes that ultimately lead to his demise, although there's more issues than just these. He makes a sacrifice that's supposed to be made by the priests. He makes an oath that technically means he should kill his son. and he doesn't follow God's instructions about the Amalekites, namely to utterly destroy them, because he brings back Agag alive and he keeps some of the treasure and the people and the animals and stuff. And in 1 Samuel 6:15, that's when we get this horrendous story about Samuel hacking Agag to pieces. Think about this. This is exactly what Achan does at Ai. He doesn't obey on this particular commandment. So the sins of Israel are being repeated by Saul, and he's judged for it. David, on the other hand, is anointed by God, and there are so many parallels between David and Christ. We can't go over them all. I would encourage you to read something like Spurgeon's Treasury of David on the Psalms, because he makes connections there. His sermons on David's life are full of connections. Robert Barron's commentary, as well as Francesca Murphy's commentary, both in the Brazos series, help tremendously in this regard. We don't have time to go over them, but David is the king that God has for his people, rather than the king that their sinful hearts are clamoring for. He leads Israel out of bondage from their enemies. He leads them in wisdom. He brings the ark to dwell in Jerusalem, so that the dwelling place of God is at the center of all of Israel's life, and they dwell with God in the land. There's all kinds of parallels here. I'm not going to go over these applications. You can read them. There's lots of things we could talk about with David. But, David's prosperity, his success as a king, his model kingship continues through 1 Samuel 10. But it is at that point, and there are hints of it beforehand, but it is really with 2 Samuel 11 and Bathsheba that everything goes downhill. And again, it's these same two threads. God is showing us what redemption looks like in certain figures in Israel, namely David here, but he's also showing us that other trajectory. Everybody is sinful, including those who God sets over Israel as redeemers. Abraham sinned, Moses sinned, David sinned, Joshua sinned. Everybody sins. And David is no exception. And David sins spectacularly. Not in the sense that we should praise his sin, but in the sense that it just is an utter failure. There is no way that we can look at David and say he was perfect. He exemplifies what it means to be a fallen human being, really. And what happens is both his rise to power and his kingship and his fall from power are exemplary, in the sense that his rise to power and the first part of his kingship points us forward to the reign of the Messiah. There's all kinds of parallels between David and Christ. But on the other hand, the way that he fails is exemplary. He fails because of idolatry, and in failing, he splits his house in two, which is what's going to happen to Israel later on. They're going to split into two kingdoms. As a result of his failure, enemies start to come in again, although it won't be later on until after his son Solomon. As a result of his failure, Israel no longer has worship at the center of its life. There's all kinds of things that are exemplary about David, positively and negatively. And we're going to see this again with Solomon. So we don't need to say that David is the zenith of the Old Testament story, because we still need to get to Solomon and the building of the temple. But the sins of David are magnified in Solomon. And the effects of sin in David are magnified in Solomon. And so David and Solomon, in one sense, go together as both the zenith and the what's the math word for the pit? The zenith and the pit of Israelite history. And this is this is the Old Testament story. God promises redemption, and he gives us pictures of redemption in these people and in these covenants, because David receives a covenant that further clarifies how God is going to save the world through Eve's seed, namely through a son like him who will build his temple, build a nation, all this sort of thing. But he's also exemplary of the other trajectory, which is that everybody fails. Nobody succeeds. Adam failed, Noah failed, Abraham failed, Moses failed, Joshua failed, the judges failed, David failed, Solomon failed, we fail. Everybody fails. And so the story of David really shows us that. And we've seen these themes that I'm listing here just now. And one thing that I didn't mention is that he selects Jerusalem as his capital. So this is when Jerusalem becomes sort of the center of Israelite geography and Israelite theology, because Jerusalem as the capital represents the whole. Much like if somebody was reporting on international news, someone might say, today from Washington, this news came out, and it's about America as a whole, the whole country. You can say the same thing about Jerusalem. These are the aspects of God's covenant with David. He's going to provide a dwelling. He's going to raise up a son to build the temple. He's going to establish a father-son relationship with David's descendants. And this kindness to David isn't going to depart. It's not conditional like the Mosaic covenant is. There's two aspects here. There is a sense in which this covenant continues in the Mosaic line, in that the geopolitical nation of Israel fails when the physical son of David fails. But on the other hand, there's an eternal aspect that's not present in the Mosaic covenant, in that there is coming one son of David who will succeed and who will have an eternal kingdom as David's son. So there's sort of a both and here, but this is different than the Mosaic one in that there is an eternal aspect to it. When Solomon comes to power, that's the beginning of the subject of 1 Kings. The author of Kings uses sources, and these are some of the sources that he names. And what he's writing about is, again, this zenith, this pinnacle in the story of Israel, followed by the French word is denouement, the denouement, if you want to Americanize that word, the recession from the pinnacle. And that's what's at stake in 1st and 2nd Kings. David reigns until 1 Kings 11, and in that reign, his major accomplishment and the subject of much of that material is his building of the temple. And so, in one sense, what we see is that all the promises of Israel have been fulfilled. The temple has been built. The house for God has been built. Solomon is wealthy. He's wise. He has rest from his enemies. The nations are coming in to seek his advice. He's reigning in Jerusalem. All of these expectations of Israel are, in one sense, fulfilled with Solomon. But 1 Kings 11 just puts the hammer on any sort of idea that this is it. This is the kingdom of God on earth, because Solomon is a sinner, like everybody is a sinner. And Solomon fails too, namely, just like David failed, just like the judges failed, especially Samson, sexual sin that leads to idolatry. And as a result, this is both the pinnacle and the pit, because it's at this point that God enacts all of the curses that he promised in Deuteronomy. He splits the kingdom in two, and eventually these two deteriorate to the point where first the northern kingdom is destroyed, the northern kingdom of Israel, and then the southern kingdom of Judah is destroyed. Things deteriorate very rapidly. There are a few bright spots, but they're few and far between. The kings of Israel, the leaders who represent the nation, all fail. And at the end of that failure, God says, I utterly destroy you. And he utterly destroys Israel. He sends them out of the land. The temple is destroyed. There is no king. Everything is gone that God had given them because they could not obey. This is the pattern. Much like there's a pattern in Judges, there's a pattern in Kings called the regnal formula. So the king's introduced, his length, who his mom was, the evaluation of his reign, how he's referenced in Chronicles, and then when he dies is buried and then succeeded. So similar, and this is really the key here, this evaluation. Hardly any of the kings are evaluated well after Solomon. Elisha and Elijah are the other two major figures. These are the prophets. So in the midst of this total failure of Israel in Kings, God sends prophets to call them to repentance, to call the leaders to the repentance. And they are Elijah and Elisha. And, again, I'm going to have to refer you to the reading material here. But needless to say, in Kings, you've got the prophets pitted against the kings. With Christ, you have the two found together, the prophet, king, who is perfect. The themes in 1st and 2nd Kings are retribution theology, namely, God enacts the curses of Deuteronomy because Israel can't obey. Also, prophecy, the prophets all say the exile is coming because Israel can't obey. And so at the end of Kings, what we have is the end of the story of historical Israel, at least pre-exile. They have gone into the land, started to conquer it and failed. God has given the king, and they have failed. The king has failed. All of the kings have failed. Everybody has failed. And so the promise that God made to Abraham, and that was then temporarily conditioned on the Mosaic covenant for the nation of Israel, has been enacted, but it's been enacted negatively. Everybody's failed, and now judgment has come. First, Sennacherib comes into Jerusalem and destroys the north, well, not into Jerusalem, but into the northern kingdom, and destroys them and takes them into exile. And then Nebuchadnezzar comes into the southern kingdom and destroys Jerusalem and takes the rest of the southern kingdom into exile. And so Israel is no more. There is no more temple. There is no more king. There is no more land. What happens next? That's what we'll talk about when we get to the latter prophets.